I had never been one to believe in superstitions. I was always guided by reason, by the unyielding logic that defines my work as a lawyer. I dealt with concrete facts, irrefutable evidence, and arguments that supported reality as it is, leaving no room for mysticism or childish fantasies. To me, the real world had always seemed very distant from the horror stories we hear in childhood, those fables meant to frighten children or convey moral lessons. I believed, almost obstinately, that the inexplicable only existed until it was explained. However, all my skepticism crumbled without my noticing on the day that cursed clock entered my life. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing exceptional. I had decided, almost in a fit of impulsiveness, to take a few hours for myself, a rare moment of respite. The office had consumed almost all my energy in recent weeks, and I felt a profound exhaustion, the kind that seems to seep into every bone of the body. I wandered the city aimlessly. The usually bustling streets did not bother me as they once did, and the thought of getting lost among the shop windows was strangely comforting. It was amid this unassuming stroll that my steps led me to a little-traveled street, a discreet alley hidden among the tall buildings. The fog glass of the small antique shop almost went unnoticed, but something inside caught my attention, an invisible magnetism that I could not comprehend at the time. The shop was an anachronistic place, trapped in a time that no longer existed. As soon as I crossed the heavy door, I was greeted by the smell of aged wood and a slightly dusty touch in the air, as if that place had been sealed off from the outside world. Antique furniture was chaotically piled in the corners, while small relics from another era filled every available space on the shelves. Everything stood there, motionless, yet seemed laden with a history that time had left behind. I remember clearly the dim light filtering through the dirty windows, obscured by a layer of dust, giving the environment a sense of something forgotten, as if I had crossed the invisible line separating the real from the unknown. It was among those forgotten relics that I saw it. A pendulum clock, enormous, the kind of piece that should not go unnoticed, yet seemed to merge with the surroundings. Time had left its marks on its dark wooden surface, but that only accentuated its grandeur. The pendulum moved methodically, mesmerizingly, silently, yet with a precision that seemed to slice through the air. It was impossible to look away. There was something in it that held me captive, something deeply unsettling, yet simultaneously alluring. "Where did you find this?" The question slipped from my lips before I could stop myself. I didn't know why I was so fascinated by that object. Perhaps it was merely the need to distract myself from all the accumulated stress, to let my mind wander through something that didn't involve lawsuits and paperwork. Or perhaps there was something more. The shopkeeper, a short man bent under the weight of age, appeared from behind the counter. His glasses, precariously perched on the tip of his nose, gave him an almost caricatured look. He looked at me for a moment before responding, his hoarse voice echoing against the walls, wrapped in a tone I hadn't perceived at the time, but now, in retrospect, sounds like a warning. "It came with the shop. It was here when I bought it. They say it's from the early 20th century. Very old and peculiar." The word peculiar resonated in my mind like a kind of enigma, but at the time, I ignored it. Peculiar to me seemed merely a charming addition to that antiquated object. Something about it convinced me that I needed to have it, an irrational impulse that seemed to run parallel to my normally logical nature. Without a second thought, I bought the clock, almost as if I were being guided by an invisible force. When I brought it home, a strange sensation enveloped the space. The clock seemed made for that place, as if it had always belonged there, beside the rarely used fireplace. The pendulum swung tirelessly, and even without making a sound, its presence seemed to fill the room. There was no more silence, only a constant feeling of movement, of time suspended. Somehow, the atmosphere of the room had changed, as if the air had become denser, heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted since the clock had crossed my threshold. In the first few days, I didn't pay much attention to its presence. It was just another decorative item. But after a few nights, something strange began to happen. Every night at 3:33 a.m., I would wake up, suddenly alert, as if someone were shaking me out of my dreams. I would sit up in bed, my eyes heavy with sleep, and observed the same scene. The clock, motionless, as if it had stopped along with time. Yet the pendulum continued to move tirelessly, defying the logic of a stopped clock. At first, I attributed it to fatigue. The incessant work, the long hours at the office were surely taking their toll. But soon, things began to become more evident. Objects in the house started to move on their own. I would leave a cup on the kitchen table, and when I returned, it was on the floor, shattered. I cleaned up the shards, believing it to be an accident. The next day, the same cup, repaired, was broken again, in the same spot. The unease within me grew as everything around seemed to toy with me, as if the house had a will of its own. The shadows began to appear soon after. I saw them in the corner of my eye, fleeting, like smudges on the periphery of my vision. I attributed it to the lighting, to the reflection of streetlights filtering through the window cracks. But the shadows took shape. At times I was sure there were figures standing in the corners of the room, merely observing. They didn't move, but they were there, like an insistent presence, reminding me that I was not alone. The repetitions began to take on an almost sinister routine. Conversations I remembered having with colleagues at the office were replayed, but with a subtle strangeness that disturbed me deeply. I found myself hearing the same words come from their mouths, as if they were acting out a rehearsed play. Yet there was always something off. Perhaps a different intonation, a smile that hadn't existed before, or a glance that didn't belong to that moment. Each time this happened, a chill ran down my spine, an uncomfortable feeling of being trapped in a cycle, unable to break the chain that imprisoned me in that same scenario. The days felt endless, stretched out, as if time had become an elastic band pulled to its limit, ready to snap. The hours didn't pass, they dragged on, slow and heavy, trapping me in a reality where everything repeated itself. Life transformed into a dusty reel spinning in a faulty loop. With each passing day, the world around me grew darker, heavier, as if the gears of time were failing, ensnaring me in a distorted version of the present. When night fell, I knew what was to come. And it was always the same. The clock, that damned clock, marked 3:33. Always. It was as if the early hours had been condemned to torment me with their endless repetition. Each time I awoke, it was a jarring awakening, as if invisible hands were shaking me awake. The air in the house grew thicker, suffocating, and the shadows around me seemed to gain substance, as if they breathed around me, absorbing any trace of warmth or light. The shadows. I could no longer ignore them. Once mere silhouettes at the edge of my vision, now, they seemed almost alive. They floated through the corners of the house, silent, yet filling the space with a suffocating presence. They seemed to watch me, waiting, calculating. It was as if there was something in them that longed to emerge from the shadows and occupy the space around me. Sometimes, I could swear I saw one of them move faster, advancing toward me, but when I looked directly, it dissipated, leaving only darkness. I knew something was changing, and it was not for the better. With each passing night, these shadows felt denser, almost palpable, as if they were materializing into forms I could not fully comprehend. There was a constant sensation of being watched, of time and space around me being warped by something far beyond my understanding. And then came the whispers. At first, they were almost imperceptible, like the wind passing through the cracks in the windows, a low noise, a murmur. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I felt the desperation in their voices. They grew louder with each passing night. The sound echoed through the walls of the house, coming from every corner, enveloping me, as if the shadows themselves were gaining a voice. "Help me," I clearly heard one night, the voice reverberating in my bones. "I'm trapped," whispered another, weaker but laden with pain. They were voices heavy with suffering, imprisoned in a place I could not reach. It was at this point that I decided to investigate the origin of the clock. I searched for documents, conducted tireless internet searches, trying to uncover any clue about its provenance, but there was nothing. No record, no former owner, no mention of the existence of that object. It was as if the clock had no history, as if it had emerged from nowhere, materialized from an unknown void, just to haunt me. On that fateful night, the clock woke me once again. The sound of it marking 0333 had become a macabre alarm for me, pulling me from my dreams with cruel precision. But this time something was different. A horrific sound shattered the silence right after the clock chimed. It was a crack, followed by the sound of shattered glass. My body stiffened instantly, fear freezing me in place. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and made my way to the living room, where the source of the sound seemed to be. The house was immersed in shadows, but the faint light of the moon filtered through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the furniture. Each step I took echoed, amplifying the emptiness around me, as if I were walking into an abyss. When I finally reached the living room, the sight that awaited me paralyzed me. There, in the center of the room, sprawled on the floor, was the body of a man. He looked out of place, like a grotesque painting thrown into the familiar setting of my home. His face was turned to the side, his eyes wide and devoid of any life, the remnants of him reflecting the pale moonlight. Blood flowed slowly from a deep cut in his neck, spreading across the floor in a thick, dark pool, staining the environment with a color that made me nauseous. Terror gripped me in a way I never imagined possible. My legs wobbled, my chest tight with distress. Every cell in my body screamed for me to run, to flee from there, but I couldn't move. My eyes were instinctively drawn to the corner of the room, where the clock, always present, always watchful, remained. The pendulum swung, but erratically, as if it itself had lost its connection to time. It was a disordered movement that left me even more dazed. The next day, the body had vanished. There were no traces, not the faintest hint that someone or something had been there. The living room was exactly as I had left it before the incident, everything intact in an almost unsettling order. There were no bloodstains, no broken glass, and the shadows that had once seemed to pulse with life had quieted. My eyes swept the space, trying to capture any evidence of the previous night, but everything seemed to have been erased like a mistake on a piece of paper. The most rational explanation was that it had all been a nightmare. I tried to convince myself of that, repeating the thought in my head like a mantra. It was just a dream. It was just a dream. But deep down, a part of me knew that wasn't true. Something whispered in the depths of my mind, an unsettling certainty that what I had seen was real. And worse still, there was an invisible presence, something that nestled in the atmosphere, an energy that seemed to subtly alter the space around me, bending and twisting reality in ways I couldn't explain. The clock. It was manipulating me, stretching the fabric of time like an artisan deforming clay, shaping my perception, my world. The days that followed were a fog of torment. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was merely a projection of my mind, now clearly on the verge of collapse. The clock was a constant presence, its ticking echoing through the house relentlessly, as if driving its rhythm into my veins. My sleep became sporadic and heavy, filled with visions that left me more exhausted upon waking than when I lay down. Every time I closed my eyes, the shadows returned, dense and intrusive, as if waiting, hungry for my surrender. I saw fragments of the dead man, flashes of his lifeless face, the blood pooling beneath his body. It was on one of those nights when sleep completely eluded me that I decided to delve into the history of the clock. There was something terribly wrong with that object, and I was determined to uncover what it was. I spent countless hours scouring online archives, obscure forums, anything that might give me a clue about its origin. And then, after days that dragged on as if each second were an eternity, I finally found something. The clock had belonged to a man named Samuel Norwood. The information came fragmented, almost lost in the forgotten corners of history, like a footnote that no one paid attention to. Norwood had been a skilled watchmaker, almost obsessed with time and its fluidity. He had created the clock shortly before his death, a masterpiece that, according to some rumors, was destined to be something much more than a mere mechanical piece. Norwood, as I managed to ascertain, died tragically. No one knew exactly how, but the mystery surrounding his death continued to resonate like a forgotten legend. In the final days of his life, Samuel spoke of distortions, of overlapping realities, and of a time that no longer flowed in a linear fashion. He was convinced that he had discovered something beyond human comprehension, a secret that defied the very laws of physics. His accounts mentioned a temporal cycle, an invisible prison where he was trapped inside the very clock he had created. Insanity seemed to have taken hold of his last moments, or at least that was what his contemporaries believed. But now, with my mind clouded by terror, I began to question that assumption. The clock, that artifact I had brought into my home, was not just an old and beautiful piece. It was much more. It was completing something, trying to finish what Samuel had started, and I was merely a piece in the game. Each repetition, every shadow that seemed to come alive, each disturbing vision of the dead man in the middle of the room, everything was connected. It was a message, a desperate attempt by Samuel to escape. He wasn't just dead, he was imprisoned, and somehow, I had become the conduit for his release. The weeks passed in an indistinct haze, the days flowing and repeating in an endless succession of nearly identical events. The clock continued to strike 3:33 every morning, waking me from fevered dreams that felt more real than the day itself. My sanity seemed to wear away with each chime, each movement of the pendulum, until one fateful night, everything became clear. That night, the clock struck 3:33 again. But this time, instead of fear, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Something inside me finally understood what was happening. I descended to the living room, driven by an almost instinctual force, drawn by the sound of the clock. The pendulum swung frantically, as if time were at war with itself, trying to stabilize but failing. The air around me was heavy, as if the very atmosphere were a thick curtain I needed to pass through to reach the clock. The floor trembled gently beneath my feet, vibrating with an energy that seemed to emanate from the heart of the house itself. And then, he appeared. Samuel, or at least, what remained of him. His figure was a distorted shadow, an undefined silhouette caught between the world of the living and the dead, as if his very existence were fragmented, trapped between two planes of reality. His eyes, empty of any emotion, stared at me from a place I couldn't reach. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was imprinted in the air around me, in the echoes of the clock's unceasing ticking. The truth hit me like an avalanche. I was not alive. I had never been. I had died that day, weeks ago, the moment I bought the clock. Since then, my existence had been an infinite cycle of repetitions, reliving the events of my own death unaware. Each time the clock struck 3:33, I would awaken, never truly waking. It was an endless nightmare, a temporal prison where my spirit was doomed to relive the final moments of a life I no longer possessed. I was the ghost. Now I am trapped in this eternal cycle, with no hope of escape. Each tick-tock of the clock pulls me back, forcing me to relive the same nightmare, time and time again, with no hope of liberation. My screams, my pleas, all of it gets lost in the void, muffled by the relentless mechanics of time. And the clock, it keeps going, always. Its pendulum swings with the cruel precision of a machine, patiently waiting for the next soul who, like me, will fall into its trap. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sharp and insistent sound of my cell phone alarm, penetrating the quietude of the room like a cutting blade. The environment around me was enveloped in an almost disconcerting calm, broken only by the incessant ringing. The first lights of morning began to seep through the curtains, lazily spilling onto the floor and painting the air with a soft yet distant glow, promising a day like so many others. I sat up in bed, feeling my body heavy, as if each movement were being made underwater, dragging my mind into reality. My fingers automatically found the button to silence the alarm, and as I rubbed my eyes, I sighed, trying to gather the strength to face another day at the hospital. I have worked as a doctor for over 2 decades. 20 years of routines that, although exhausting, provided me with a sense of control. The predictability of diagnoses, the logic of procedures, the constant flow of lives I managed to save, or, inevitably, lost. I faced countless losses, watched patients fade away before my eyes, but I never felt deep regrets. It was part of the job, part of life. And there was always the certainty that I had done everything within my power. However, that morning, something was amiss, a dissonance I couldn't quite name. Though the room around me was the same, with the same curtains hanging and the same muffled sound of the city waking outside, a latent anxiety bubbled beneath the surface. It coiled in my stomach, vaguely perceptible but present, like a shadow hiding in the corners of my mind. I prepared for the day, going through the usual motions, but the discomfort lingered, like a secret I had yet to uncover. I arrived at the hospital at 7:30, as I had religiously done for years. The automatic doors opened with the same familiar creak. The unmistakable aroma of clinical disinfectant filled my nostrils, and the sound of rubber-soled shoes echoed down the hallways, a melody of the medical routine. The nurses greeted me with their polite smiles, and Clara, always punctual, was there as usual. However, something about her appearance caught my attention, awakening me in a strange way. The lab coat Clara wore was not the usual white. She was dressed in a light blue coat, almost pastel. Something so insignificant, yet inexplicably, it caused a disconcerting pang within me, a slight dissatisfaction that lodged itself in my thoughts. "Good morning, doctor," she said, her voice as soft as ever, her eyes smiling with the familiarity of years of companionship. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, battling the irrational urge to question the color of her coat. I took a deep breath, swallowing the strange unease that accompanied me like a persistent fog. I continued through the day, trying to focus on procedures and consultations, but there was an indefinable tension, an almost palpable feeling that something was out of place. It was like walking through a familiar set, yet distorted in such subtle details that only the most attentive mind would notice. I tried to brush these thoughts away, blaming the accumulated fatigue from the recent shifts, but it was futile. The discomfort infiltrated every action, like an invisible layer covering everything around me. When I finally got home, exhausted, I felt the weight of something more than work on my shoulders. I prepared a quick dinner, but the smell of the food didn't awaken my appetite. Each bite was chewed mechanically, tasteless. An uncomfortable emptiness hung in the air, a sensation that something important was being ignored. The weight on my chest had become a constant presence, a pressure I didn't know how to relieve. I went to bed early, hoping that a restorative night's sleep would erase that uncomfortable feeling. When the alarm went off the next morning at 6 a.m. sharp, something hit me even before I opened my eyes. The feeling that I had lived that moment before. The sound of the alarm, the soft glow of the sun filtering through the curtains, the way my body felt heavy as I sat on the bed, everything was an exact repetition of the day before. Every detail, every sound, even the faint aroma of coffee mixing in the air, was chillingly identical. At the hospital, the feeling of unease only worsened. Clara was once again wearing her light blue coat. The deja-vu that enveloped me was impossible to ignore now. The day unfolded in the same way. The same patients, the same procedures, the same conversations. Every word, every gesture, an exact copy of what had already happened. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue distorting my perception, but an inner voice whispered that something much deeper was occurring. On the third day, when the alarm rang and I awoke to yet another repetition, the discomfort transformed into dread. This time, the anguish hit me like a punch in the stomach. I got out of bed with my heart racing, feeling as if I were trapped in an endless nightmare. And then during my shift at the hospital, I noticed something disturbing. As I walked through the hallways, something at the edge of my vision caught my attention. A motionless figure in the waiting room. It was a man, sitting with his head bowed, his hands clasped in his lap. Initially, I didn't think much of it. However, when I passed by the same hallway hours later, the man was still there. But this time, his eyes were fixed on me, and what I saw in them made my blood run cold. There was no life in his gaze, only an abyssal emptiness. I felt a deep chill run down my spine, freezing my limbs. It was then that I recognized his face. That man. He was an old patient. He had died over 10 years ago, passing away in my arms after a desperate attempt to save him. The shock hit me like a ton of bricks. The guilt I thought I had overcome now resurfaced with full force, suffocating my rationality. And there he was, as if time had no power over his presence. The cycle continued, relentless, offering no respite to my thoughts, and with each new repeated day, the hospital became an increasingly haunting setting. The same automatic doors opened with a mechanical creak, the same strong scent of disinfectant permeated the air, but something denser infiltrated that environment, something suffocating, an atmosphere of tension that intensified with every step I took down the coldly lit corridors. And as the days passed, the figures began to materialize more frequently. Patients I hadn't seen in years, Faces that should have remained only in the darkest memories reappeared before me like ghosts trapped in some kind of purgatory. All of them dead. All with the same fixed stare, as if they carried in their eyes the pain of a life interrupted, a burden of an unresolved injustice. Every time our eyes met, I felt an overwhelming pressure building in my chest, like an invisible chain tightening around me, binding me to an unbearable reality. And in that deafening silence that only the hospital could provide, the faces appeared, one after another, all wearing an accusatory expression, condemning me without uttering a word. I knew what they wanted. I knew that, in some way, each of those faces blamed me, held me responsible for their deaths, no matter how much medical logic told me that I had done everything right. The first time I heard their voices, the impact was so strong that my legs nearly gave way under my weight. I was walking down the empty corridor when a weak, painful voice whispered in my ear. "You failed me." The voice was low, almost indistinct, but I recognized the tone, the pain, and immediately knew whose it was. Margaret. She had died on the operating table years ago. I remembered that case as if it were yesterday. I had done everything within my power, followed every protocol, every necessary step to try to save her life, but her heart simply stopped. Without warning, without explanation. Still, her voice echoed inside me, cutting like a blade of ice, invading my thoughts. "You let me die," another voice hissed near me, icy as the touch of a biting wind in winter. This time, it was Mr. Gouveia, an elderly man who had passed away from a heart attack. Another inevitable death, and once again, within the medical parameters, I was not to blame. I knew that. I had done everything right, followed the protocols to the letter. And yet, Mr. Gouveia's voice clung to me like a poison that slowly corroded the layers of self-defense I had built over the years. But it was when a third figure appeared that the ground beneath my feet seemed to collapse entirely. It was a boy, a child who looked no older than 12. His face was deformed, covered with grotesque scars that obscured much of his expression, but even with those marks, I knew exactly who he was. Noah. His name echoed in my mind like a distant echo, a memory I had avoided at all costs, yet now it stood before me, unavoidable. Of all the deaths that had crossed my path over these 20 years of practice, his was the only one that haunted me during sleepless nights. The only one that truly caused me insomnia, nights upon nights of suffocating regret, buried beneath layers of justifications. Noah had been my patient years ago. He arrived at the hospital with a severe but treatable infection. One of those infections that, if properly treated, shouldn't lead to death. I knew that. I clearly remember the day he was admitted. Exhaustion consumed me. I had spent the night awake with other cases. My mind was foggy. In that moment, I didn't think twice before passing the responsibility to a resident, a young doctor whom I considered competent enough at the time to handle the situation. I trusted his judgment. But what happened next was an irreversible mistake. A small error, almost insignificant in the eyes of many, but devastating in its consequences. An incorrect dosage of medication. Something that could have been corrected in minutes, but time was cruel. Noah did not survive. Guilt had always hung over me like a heavy shadow since then, but I never openly admitted it. To myself and to others, I always blamed the circumstances. The fatigue, the workload, the resident's failure. But now, seeing Noah standing before me with his fragile body marked by the scars of his short life, everything I had always tried to bury surged forth with overwhelming force. His eyes, fixed on me, didn't carry the same silent accusations as the other patients. No, Noah's eyes held a deep pain, a sorrow that transcended death. He wasn't there to accuse me. He was there waiting for something, waiting for me to finally admit the mistake that consumed me from within. My lips trembled, my sweaty hands clenched into fists at my sides as I tried to maintain control, but inside me, something was breaking. I knew, the moment our gazes locked, that there would be no peace, no end to this vicious cycle until I faced the truth I had been avoiding. Noah wasn't there for revenge. He was there for the truth. The truth I evaded every morning I woke up, trying to move forward, ignoring the nightmares, the sleepless nights, and the voices that began to surround me. The cycle continued, and with each passing day, more faces emerged, more voices, more gazes. But it was Noah who held me, forcing me to confront the abyss within myself. The hospital, once a sanctuary of control and logic, had transformed into an emotional prison where the past manifested as living shadows, compelling me to revisit every moment of failure, every mistake, every lost life. And at the center of it all was Noah, the boy who should never have died, but who now wouldn't let me rest until the truth was spoken. Despair grew within me, consuming every part of my being, like an overwhelming wave threatening to swallow me whole. The torment seemed endless, echoing with each beat of my heart in every heavy breath. Deep down, I knew there was only one way to break that hellish cycle that ensnared me. It was a truth that haunted me, but at the same time, it revealed itself as the only way out. I could no longer run away. There was nowhere left to hide. The weight of guilt was unbearable, and the only way to relieve this burden was to confront it, to face what I had avoided for so long. In that same unbearable repetition, before the clock marked the start of yet another relentless day, I made a decision that would change everything. I would speak. I would put into words what I had kept locked in the depths of my mind for so many years. I would confess my mistake to the world, even knowing that by doing so, I would be destroying everything I had built. With nerves on edge, every muscle in my body tense, I prepared for what would be the most decisive moment of my life. I called a press conference. The cold of the conference room, adorned with white and impersonal lights, made the atmosphere feel even more distant from reality. The white walls seemed to close in around me, and the chairs arranged in orderly rows gave a sense of impending judgment. It was not just any room. It was a stage, a courtroom, where my career, my honor, and my life would be put to the test. As I entered the space, the muffled sound of murmurs and quick footsteps echoed in the air, and I soon felt all eyes on me. My colleagues were there, sitting in the front rows, with expressions of curiosity and concern etched on their faces. The media was also present, their microphones and cameras focused on me, ready to capture every word, every movement. My heart pounded violently against my chest, to the point that I felt pressure rising in my throat, making every breath a challenge. It was as if an invisible knot was tightening, strangling me as anxiety increased. Sweat trickled down my temples, a clear sign of the nervousness I could barely contain. My mind raced, reviewing every detail of what I was about to confess, while a part of me still sought a way to escape, to retreat. But there was no turning back. With a trembling voice and restless hands, I began to speak. The words came out more hesitantly than I had expected, but once I started, there was no stopping. I told everything. I confessed the mistake I had made. I revealed, in detail, the negligence that led to Noah's death. I explained how, on that fateful day, I had delegated responsibility to the resident, overwhelmed by exhaustion and mental fatigue, and how that resulted in the wrong dosage of medication. I spoke of the guilt that had been eating away at me since then, about the sleepless nights, the intrusive memories, the voices that haunted me in every repetition of the endless cycle. Each word that left my mouth seemed to open a new wound in my soul, exposing me to the relentless judgment of those who were listening. As the confession unfolded, I could see shock spreading across the faces in front of me. The expressions of disbelief, disappointment, and even disgust were evident, even if no one spoke. The atmosphere in the room felt suffocating, as if the air had thickened, making it even harder to breathe. Each passing second felt like an eternity, and at the end of the confession, the silence that followed was deafening. I had expected some immediate reaction, a word of comfort, or perhaps a direct condemnation, but what came was absolute emptiness. The sound of camera flashes seemed distorted, as if coming from far away, echoing in a space that was not mine. I looked at the faces in the room, searching for any sign of understanding, of empathy, but all I found was the crushing weight of the reality I had just created. My name would be destroyed, my prestige, my career, everything I had fought and worked for over the years was about to crumble like a house of cards hit by a strong wind. And in that moment, I had hoped to at least feel some relief. I imagined that by exposing my truth, the weight of guilt I had carried for so long would be lifted from my shoulders. I waited for the relief that so many described feeling after a confession. But all that hit me was a profound shame, a shame that pierced through me entirely, burning inside like fire. There was no relief, no instant redemption. What remained was the acknowledgement that I had just destroyed the only thing that still defined me. But something changed. Something invisible yet tangible occurred after the words were spoken. That very night, as I lay down, a different silence enveloped the environment. The dread of waking up again at 6 a.m., the fear of reliving the same excruciating day, had vanished. It was a deep silence, like a storm that had finally dissipated, leaving the air fresh and a feeling of a new beginning. For the first time in years, sleep came peacefully. No voices whispering in the dark, no shadows lurking in my mind. When I opened my eyes the next morning, something as simple as the clock beside my bed marked the end of a cycle. The digital clock glowed with the number 7, and the sunlight flooding the room no longer felt oppressive. It no longer brought the same sense of entrapment. It was a different light, softer, more real. The cycle had finally been broken. The torment was over, not through forgetting, but through truth. The ghosts that had once surrounded me, watching me with their accusatory and pained gazes, had vanished, and with them, the unbearable burden of guilt that I had carried for so many years. My reputation, of course, was in ruins. The career that had once been a source of pride lay destroyed. I knew I would never be seen with the same eyes again. But in that moment, none of it mattered. For the first time after so long, I felt something that had completely eluded me during all those years of guilt and regret. Freedom. I was finally free to move on without the invisible chains of the past dragging me down.